We have many books here at the Fireside Tales. Books on how the universe began, and the time before it. Books on how to cheat death. And even a few books that if you were to get too close would try to eat you. We do our best to stay away from these stories. But there are some, of course, which we are not in the possession of. One such is Lucinda and His Daughter, which is currently the property of the U.S. government. Now, we here at the Fireside Tales do not dispute their claims over this book. They were the ones that found it. It legally belongs to them. We would suggest that they hand it over to us in the case something were to happen. If something were to happen. But that is their decision. And if I cannot read from you, Lucinda and His Daughter, I will instead tell you the story of how it came to be in their hands. And it is a very interesting tale, but to do it right, I will be speaking it from the words of the person who experienced it. A Samuel Travers, who was 16 years old when this occurred in 1772. Now, I will warn you that this is recited from memory, and I might get a few things wrong, but I will be doing my best to get to the heart of the tale, which one could argue is the only place where it's really important. But, to begin our first entry, which occurred on November 1st, 1772. You will have to excuse me, my readers, if some of my spelling is incorrect or my grammar is wrong. The truth is that this is the first time that I have ever put quill to parchment, but it seemed only natural, seeing as how much I read all of the time, that eventually I should put down words myself. To tell my story, well, it would be rather boring, for I'm just a nobody person. I spend all of my time reading books on every sort of subject. I have read books on astronomy, physics, mathematics, but I also have a weakness for other kinds of stories that are not based in the rational, stories like Don Quixote, or the works of William Shakespeare, or the epics of Homer. I have read every book that you could imagine. But I will admit that my personal favorite is Lucinda and His Daughter. I don't know where this book came from, actually. It just showed up on my shelf one day, as if it had always been there. And I have looked for an author or for a publication date, but it doesn't seem to have one. I have read and reread this book 100 times and still haven't grown tired of it. The world fills me with such excitement. So many fantastical things happen to the characters, or the two main characters, Lucinda and his daughter Nim. I could tell you so many stories. Stories of how they would go off on adventures in a giant hot air balloon, and one time they got blown by a wind and were afraid that they were going to be lost forever and would never make it back to Tensil Town. But luckily everything, of course, turned out all right. Another time how they discovered a mermaid and her father, and they were able to get them back home to their place underneath the sea. And then another story of how they accidentally changed all of the callers in the town. And Mayor Zippet was quite angry about this, and they had to do their best to get everything restored to its proper place. The world truly fills me with fascination. I must admit that not a lot of people come to visit me. Uh, in fact, the only person who really does is our slave Limerick, who will come in from time to time and give me some food and strike up a conversation with me. Other than that, the only person I ever meet will be my father, who will come in from time to time. But he's usually very quiet and is very secretive, always away on business of some sort. I'm not exactly sure what. But even when he is here, he rarely speaks to me. He's a very quiet man, although always nice to me, and has never hurt me or anything like that. Anyways, the hours are getting rather late, and I must say that for my first bit of writing, I think you all now understand a little bit about myself, even if there really isn't much else to say, but that I read books. I will come back to you in the morning when more inspiration strikes. And this is actually where the diary entry ends, and we skip around quite a lot until something eventually happens, which occurs February 18th, and this is what the boy says he saw. I was sitting in my room today when the most curious thing happened. You will not believe me, by readers, but as I was um, taking a look again at Lucinda and His Daughter, I saw a white horse appear before me, and flowers growing on the ground. But the moment that I blinked, this picture was gone. I assumed that it must have simply been my imagination. And yet, I am not sure. It seems almost as if the book were calling for me. We skip ahead quite a few months more until we reach July 8th. My readers, again, a similar occurrence happened. I had reread Lucinda and His Daughter for the 5th time now, after the experience, and I again saw something. I saw before me a beautiful princess, and she was sitting there. And the moment that I blinked, she was gone. Again, I cannot be sure if this wasn't my imagination, but I've looked into more about where the book might come from, and as far as I can tell, no one has ever heard of it, and no library that I have visited, no townsfolk that I have talked to, so I can only assume that perhaps it just comes from nowhere. I will tell you more as I read further into this book. Then, once again, quite a lot of months pass before we get the next diary entry, which starts off with a warning. It occurs on, actually again, November 11th. My readers, you will not believe the story that I'm about to tell you. But let me assure you that everything that I say is true, and that Lucinda and His Daughter is real as you or I. I was not supposed to tell you all this story. I fear every word that I write right now, but I feel that it is necessary that someone eventually hears, that everyone will eventually know. First up, let me say that I was again reading from the book. And this time as I was sitting there and staring at a bug as I flipped through a few pages, I thought to myself, wouldn't it be curious if Lucinda and Nim were to appear before me and I were in their shack as I am reading these words? As I glanced down and read those words, it happened. Pop, there I was. And there was Lucinda and Nim staring at me, and I was staring back at them. And the book was gone, and I was just at that shack. And as we all sat there, Lucinda spoke. My daughter, do you see that rough-looking boy right there? And she said, yes, father. He's just sort of popped into our room, didn't he? And I said to them, where am I? What exactly is this place? How is all this happening? And the man, he and the daughter, they looked at me for a moment, and then finally Lucinda said, calm yourself down, my dear boy. Oh dear, it seems like everything always happens on Wednesdays, doesn't it? Go ahead, take a seat. We will try and figure out exactly what is going on here." And Nim said, "Oh yes, please take a seat. I'm sure everything's just fine. Just relax." And so I sat down, and Lucinda went off into the kitchen to fix a cup of tea. And I said to her, Are you Nim?" And she said, "Oh, why, yes, I am." Oh, dear me, it seems as if I have entered the world of the book, Lucinda and His Daughter. I don't know how exactly this has happened, but I must get back home to my family. They're up there waiting for me. How could all of this have occurred? And she said, "Oh, just relax. Father, it seems that he comes from a book. Or he says that we are characters from a book. I guess words on a printed page," Lucinda said. "Well, isn't that interesting?" And he came back in. I would later think to myself how odd it was that Lucinda and Nim had such an ordinary reaction to me appearing there. But you must understand that things like this happen to them all the time, and they had just become very much used to it. But as we sat there and drank tea, I told them all about all the things that had happened. And Lucinda said, "I think the wisest move for us right now would be for me to go into the town and alert the folks there, and we can figure out exactly what we all are going to do." And anyways, he walked off. But the moment that he walked off, well, time passed, but this is where things begin to get a little more complicated. For you see, I soon learned that when you are in the book world, time does not move in the same manner that it does in the real world. For you and I, a few hours would go by and we would experience them. But in the book world, that time would go by and you would be aware of it going by, but it would just happen in a moment, as if things were happening moment from moment, and not by second by second. I know that what I'm saying is probably confusing to you, my readers, but the best way that I can describe it is that the hours passed, but that I couldn't exactly remember what exactly happened in them. But anyways, the next moment Lucinda and Zippet were in the room along with many of the townsfolk, an old man with a very long beard, and a bright white horse with a princess on top of it, and they were all looking down at me, and I said, "Nim, did you see that? A whole bunch of time just passed by, but I didn't even really feel it going." And she said, "I didn't feel anything at all." "This here," said Lucinda, "this is the boy." And they all began to examine me for a moment. "Well, if what he says is true, he might be a great boon to our economy," said Mayor Zippet. "Imagine if all the other kingdoms knew we had a boy from some other world." And, the other townsfolk seemed a little more skeptical about me. "I think he's a spy. He's coming here to destroy us, I guarantee it." And I said, Please, I'm not a spy. I'm not anything like that. I want to go home. If any of you could help me." And Lucinda said, "I say we cut him open. Do a little experiment on him, see his anatomy." And Nim said, "Oh, Father, I'm sorry. He's not really going to do that. Are you, Father?" "Oh, all right," he said. "No. But on the subject of helping you, boy, I might be able to. We have a few charms in town that might be able to take you back to your world, if you wish so." And I said, "Oh, yes, please, please, if you could help me, I would greatly appreciate it." "But you'll have to stay here for a little while," said Lucinda. "Well, I suppose that's just the way it has to be, too," I said. Mayor Zippet was quick to agree. Yes, we'll keep you here for a little while, and once we are able to find some way of getting you back, we'll take you back. Suppose you wouldn't be much use for us anyways. You're just a boy. You don't even have any powers. Can you even blow fire? Or anything like that? Or can you turn gigantic?" "No," I said. He shrugged his shoulders. "Well, I tried." Anyways, they all began to move off, as if I was very uninteresting to them. But I was to stay there for some time, and I did. Many days passed, and I would go out into the town with Nim, and I would explore. It was quite a wonderful thing to adventure around this place. One time I went into the great garden down at Tensil Town, and I saw all sorts of things. A giant toad, who was rather croaking angrily at me and rather grumpily as if I had interrupted him, and flowers of all sorts. I couldn't actually place them in any of our books. And here I, the teller of the story, will interrupt and say that the reason he didn't know what flowers they were was because they were not from this world, of course. But actually, from illustrations I have seen of them, they look like stuff from the Voynich manuscript. Anyways, that's neither here nor there. I saw all sorts of things in that town. I saw a shop, a tea shop, that was made out from an actual big cup of tea, and you could go into the glass and you could see the woman there who's made of glass as well. I saw a bunch of dancing mice and would often watch them, and a man pass by with a great bicycle, and he was so big, and I even got to meet the mermaid and his daughter, who came to town one day and would tell me all sorts of stories of the kingdom of under the sea, and how it was like down there. And yet all of my time I really tried to spend with Nim. I began to learn everything that I could about her. And I must confess to you, my readers, that the two of us would often go on walks together in the forest. And one time we were sitting down by the lake, and I said to her, "This world truly is amazing. Amazing is the only word you could really place for it. But I must say that I can't quite grasp it. I mean, in our world, everything is rational. Everything has to have a rational explanation to it. But in this world, everything is just so irrational." And she looked at me for a moment and seemed to be paying attention to my words. "And you see, what I don't understand is, how exactly can all of this even work? Shouldn't it all just fall apart? If there's no way to explain everything, how can anything be?" And she seemed to be studying for a moment and then said, "That is incredibly rude of you." And I said, "Excuse me? You coming in here and criticizing our world, saying how that everything should make sense or shouldn't make sense. You know, the problem with you is that you don't understand. Just because everything doesn't make sense here doesn't mean it's any better or worse than your world where everything does make sense. How would you like it if I came to your world and started complaining about how everything worked?" And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend you." "Well, you did," she said. "Just because something's different doesn't mean it's wrong. You should be ashamed." And she lifted up her head for a moment, and I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, Nim. I never meant to offend you." She turned back at me, and she smiled. "Oh, that's all right. I suppose you didn't know any better." She actually said this in a way that made me feel as if she had never really been offended at all. She was a very odd person, I had always thought. And as she was walking away, she said something that I never would forget. "You know, just because I'm just a character from a book, well, that doesn't necessarily make me any more real than you. I mean, after all, maybe you're just from a story yourself. Did you ever think of that? Maybe we're all just stories within stories. Or maybe the only real things are the things that we truly believe in, the things that make us feel the most." And she walked off, and I sat there and I thought about her words. I will confess to you, my dear readers, that I was in love with her. I had never been in love with a person as much as her. I would study everything she did and all the irrational ways she handled things, and somehow they all made sense to me. And that it was why, one night as we were sitting there, and we were drinking some tea, that I was more than a bit upset when Lucinda burst through the door, and he said, "I have done it! I have found a charm that should bring you back." Mayor Zippet had been found me. It was from some salesman without any ears, and then without any hands, then without any legs. His body parts kept disappearing and reappearing. That's all you need to know. But anyways, my children, this here little box, he said, When you pull the lever, will call forth the great gods, some sort of beings from another place. And these beings will take you back to your own world. You just have to say the chant right. And he continued saying this for a second. And he tried saying it, but it didn't seem to work. And finally he turned to me. Well, I'm sorry, my good boy. It seems that this box might have just cost me quite a few coins. And I said to him, It's quite all right, Lucinda. The truth is, I need you to hold all of your plans to take me back to that world, for I refuse to go. What's that? He said. But the people up there, they're waiting for you. I know, I said, but I have realized that everyone has a place where they belong, and I know that it was destined for me to come here, and that this is the place that I belong. I'm sorry to the world up there, but I can't go back. And to tell you even further the truth, I'm in love with your daughter, Nim. When I said this, she looked at me, and there seemed to be, for the first time I'd ever saw and ever would see, a bit of shock on her face. But then Lucinda said, My boy, I have just one thing to say to you. You don't know what you're talking about. We have to get you back home. And anyways, he began to turn the box and say a few more words, and I said, Oh, no, please, don't do it. I can't. And Nim grabbed hold of her father, too. Please, father, listen to him. This is his decision, and if he wants to stay here, he can. And Lucinda seemed to be struggling with it for a moment. But as we stood there, he finally said, Well, I suppose we could at least hold off. For a moment, maybe it's best to get the townsfolk's opinion on the matter, and not just have you popping away without any real good reason. Well, anyways, as we stood there, however, I began to notice myself beginning to fade. And I yelled at him that something was happening, that I was going, and I couldn't explain why. And then, there I was, back in my room, laying on the couch, and all around me was, people standing around, and my father was in the head, and he was, my father Thomas Travers, staring down at me with a solemn look. And as I stared up at him, he began to cry, and he fell down upon me and hugged me and said, My son, you're back. Oh, I was so worried about you. What has happened? How did I get here again? And he stood up and he explained. We don't know how it happened, and I'm sure this is a lot for you. But somehow you were trapped inside that book, and we've had quite a lot of trouble getting you back out. We've tried for many days, and finally we came upon a scheme. We painted some of the words and rewrote new words in their place. We wrote into this that you would come back to this world, in those sentences, saying that you needed to come back to your father and that the story was over. Anyways, as he looked at me, I felt a pang of fear, and I said, No, I have to go back there. Rewrite in the book. Rewrite that I have to go back. At least for... And I was stuttering, and finally Thomas Travers said, Just relax. We cannot do that, he said. What do you mean? I said. I mean that we can't take you back. It's too dangerous. You might get stuck in there forever, and I'd never be able to forgive myself. I'm sorry, my son. And I sat there and I said, But you could just send me back for a moment. Just a second, that's all I'm asking for. And he shook his head. It's too much of a risk. I was so angry with him that I didn't speak to him for quite a few days, although I did speak to the other people there, as they all were very much excited that I had made a return, and we had a great party. But many days passed, and they were some of the most miserable I'd ever experienced in my life, and all I could think about was Lucinda and His Daughter, and my place there. But a day came when my father came up, and he took me by the hand and said he wanted to take me somewhere. I didn't answer him, but we went in a carriage and we rode along. And as we sat there, going past the countryside, I couldn't help but think that at that moment, the two of us knew each other far better than we ever had in our entire life. Eventually we arrived at a house, and we went in. There were a whole bunch of people there. And the person that stood up, with a powder wig on his head, gave my father a shake. And I soon began to realize that my father was part of the rebels, and that this man was George Washington. Apparently, my father had indeed been working on something very private, after all. And my father handed the book, Lucinda and His Daughter, over to Mr. Washington, and he took a look at it and said, "Fascinating. We finally have something like this. Been looking for it for quite some time. My boy, your father asked me to have a few words with you." And I could not help but look up at him, for I was surprised by the gentleness in his voice. "You see, this story belongs to something that we can't put our fingers on. We've tried to destroy it, for we fear that it will upset the very balance of how everything works. And despite our attempts, destroying it has not proven easy. But this might be the beginning of hope, the beginning of the end of the man in gray. Now, my son, I know all of this is a lot for you to take in, but you must understand that you are not a part of that world. And I would ask you, although you probably think that I am just a cruel old man, I would ask you, please, you need to move on. You need to forget." As I looked up at him, I saw the kindness in his eyes. But I didn't say anything. I couldn't say anything. He smiled at me for a moment, and then he took Lucinda and His Daughter and put it on his shelf. Well, perhaps things will get better. It's the way to think about it, right? Eventually. Anyways, we left. I must say that I'm not sure if things will get better. I guess I will have to find out, my dear readers. I believe my journey through this life has only begun. I should mention here a little bit at the end, and this is me speaking, the teller, that Samuel Travers actually did not have a bad life, and his journey wasn't actually a terrible one. He became quite rich. He was already rich, but he got even more rich. And pretty much, nothing really, eventful happened to him, honestly. Oddly enough, though, he never married. And as for Lucinda and His Daughter, well, I will confess that we were able to get some illustrations back, during the Obama administration. Not actually illustrations, but pictures of the illustration, some of the pages. And amongst those, I found a single picture of a little girl, staring off into space. Now I know you all are thinking to yourself that it would be quite silly to go around believing in things that aren't real, especially things just printed on a page. And I'm sure that all of you are feeling quite frightened at the very idea that such a book could exist in this world. And maybe a few of you are feeling a little sad for Samuel Travers. But however you're feeling, all I can say is what I have to say with every tale here. That simply, that is the way things happen.